Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're looking at something quite unique, really, not just a standard corporate report.
No, not at all. We're digging into the 2024 Shareholders letter. It's part financial summary, sure, but it's also this wide-ranging take on the state of the world.
A blistering critique, almost. Our mission here is to unpack his big warnings about the global picture, then connect that to his very specific points on U.S. domestic policy, and finally, touch on some surprisingly frank management advice he shares.
Exactly. And what makes it essential reading, really, is how it links everything together. Global geopolitical threats aren't separate from domestic economic health or even corporate strategy, according to him. He's talking about the fate of the free and democratic world, not just bank profits.
Okay, let's jump right in with maybe the heaviest statement in the whole document. He says the world faces the most perilous and complicated geopolitical and economic environment since World War II.
That's quite a claim. It is a very stark opening. And he doesn't just leave it hanging there. He points to specific things: the ongoing wars and violence, Ukraine, the Middle East,
Right.
growing friction with China, and then the really worrying prospect of Iran getting nuclear weapons. He actually calls it a catastrophic situation.
And his analysis seems to be that these aren't just isolated fires, are they? He sees a pattern.
Precisely. He views them as part of a larger challenge to the whole international structure that America helped build after the war, the post-1945 rules-based system.
You mean things like Bretton Woods, NATO,
Yeah.
that framework?
Exactly that framework. He argues that certain adversaries are actively working to dismantle American influence, which means breaking down those alliances and economic structures. His warning is that if that happens, we end up in a kind of every nation for itself world.
Which sounds chaotic for trade, for security.
Highly volatile, where adversaries, not allies, potentially set the rules.
So, faced with that scale of a threat, what does he propose America should actually do?
Well, he outlines a pretty comprehensive five-part strategy. First, restore America's shared values. Second, fix the deep domestic problems we face. Third, really drive economic growth, but inclusively.
Okay.
Fourth, and this is key, initiate a comprehensive foreign economic policy, not just diplomacy or military might. And fifth, underpinning it all, affirm military strength, quote, at whatever cost.
It's interesting that fixing domestic issues is right there in the mix with military power. Suggests one depends on the other.
Absolutely. Internal strength as a foundation for external leadership.
Which brings us to the U.S. economy itself. He acknowledges it's been resilient, but then there's a huge but, isn't there? He questions how we got that resilience.
Right. He's quite skeptical about whether the current economic strength is actually sustainable. He argues it's been sort of artificially inflated.
How so?
Primarily through massive government deficit spending and all the stimulus money pumped in. We're talking almost $11 trillion borrowed and spent just since the start of COVID.
11 trillion. It's just a staggering number. What's the danger of relying on that?
Well, the short-term effect is it boosts consumption, keeps things moving. But the long-term risk, he flags the current U.S. fiscal deficit running around $2 trillion a year. That's about 6.6% of GDP.
Which is high.
Extremely high for peacetime, especially when it's not being driven by a recession. He flat out says this level of deficit spending isn't sustainable growth.
And he connects this directly to inflation, suggesting markets might be too optimistic about interest rates coming down soon.
Exactly. He points to factors likely leading to stickier inflation. It's not just the debt. It's increased spending globally on restructuring supply chains, on green energy transitions, on military buildups. And then he throws in tariffs. He describes recent tariffs as one large additional straw on the camel's back. Because tariffs, fundamentally, are taxes that raise prices. They might serve a purpose, but they contribute to that sticky inflation, potentially keeping rates higher for longer than many expect.
That's a really clear link. And it moves us nicely from the big global picture to what he sees as America's internal weaknesses. He lists over 10 domestic problems, causing, as he puts it, legitimate frustration and anger. This is where it gets quite pointed about policy.
Yes, this section is pretty direct. He really drills down into the sources of that frustration. He starts with wage stagnation.
The feeling that many people just aren't getting ahead.
Precisely. He cites data showing that between 1979 and 2019, the wage growth for the top 10% of earners was almost 10 times the growth for the bottom 10%.
10 times.
And for that bottom 10%, wages barely increased at all over 40 years. He argues that kind of disparity just isn't socially sustainable.
And education, which should be a ladder up, he suggests is part of the problem.
A big part, look at the numbers he uses. College costs more than doubling in 20 years, while median income only went up about 18%.
So the price of entry skyrockets while earning power stagnates.
Right. And it's not just college. He points out that many inner-city high schools graduate less than half their students. Opportunity denied right at the start for too many.
Beyond the economic fairness issue, he also tackles basic government competence, or incompetence.
Yeah, the feeling that things just don't work efficiently. He backs this up with figures like the estimate that the government makes over $200 billion in improper payments annually, just wasted money.
Wow.
But the real killer, he suggests, is the regulatory environment, the bureaucracy.
This is where he coins that term.
BLUE tape. It's brilliant, isn't it? It's not just red tape, the usual procedural stuff. BLUE tape is his term for excessive, often confusing, sometimes ideologically driven regulations, maybe drafted by people without practical real-world experience.
And this has real costs, not just frustration.
Huge costs. He mentions excessive litigation costs in the U.S. hitting over $500 billion a year.
$500 billion.
$500 billion. That's 2.5 times the average in the Eurozone. And the practical effect of all this tape, blue or red, massive delays. He gives the example of permitting for major infrastructure projects, often taking more than 10 years in the U.S.
10 years to get approval to build something.
Yeah. How can businesses plan or invest effectively with that kind of timeline? It just strangles growth.
Okay, so that's a pretty grim diagnosis of the internal problems. What about the solutions he puts forward? He wants to boost U.S. GDP growth above 3%.
That's the goal. He argues the U.S. averaged just over 2% growth from 2000 to 2024. If we could implement the right policies to consistently hit over 3%, well, the impact would be significant.
Tough, significant.
His calculation is that GDP per person would be about $16,000 higher this year alone. That's real money in people's pockets, a tangible difference.
So specific fixes. On tax and fiscal policy, he makes a pretty bold suggestion about the debt ceiling.
Very bold. He argues we should just eliminate it altogether. He calls it a political football, a weapon of mass destruction that politicians use to create crises for political gain, which just adds volatility to the financial system.
Instead of that.
He proposes a permanent bipartisan mechanism for fiscal responsibility, something mandatory, operating outside the usual political drama. He also makes a crucial point about government accounting.
Right, distinguishing investment from spending.
Yes. Stop treating building roads, ports, or broadband networks, actual long-term assets, the same way you treat day-to-day consumption expenses. If you don't make that distinction, you'll always underinvest in the future.
His ideas on education reform seem particularly focused on practical outcomes.
They really are. He argues we spend nearly $1 trillion a year on K-12 education, but we need to focus that spending on what actually works, on measurable results.
He gives examples.
Concrete examples, like Aviation High School in New York City. Graduates go straight into skilled aviation jobs, earning $80,000 a year or more.
That's impressive.
And he suggests changes like allowing federal Pell Grants, typically used for four-year colleges, to also fund shorter, say 12 to 24-week job training programs for specific skills that are in high demand, get people into good jobs faster.
A direct attack on that wage stagnation issue. Even in housing, he drills down to specific regulatory fixes.
Yeah, focused on affordability, especially for lower-income buyers. He suggests that simply streamlining existing mortgage regulations, cleaning up the BLE tape, could cut the cost of getting a mortgage by 70 to 80 basis points.
Which translates to?
The Urban Institute estimated that change alone could lead to about 1 million additional mortgage originations per year, mostly benefiting those first-time or lower-income buyers who are most sensitive to costs.
Okay, so that covers the global view and the domestic critique. Let's pivot to the company itself, because JPMC's own performance gives him the platform for these big pronouncements. Quick overview of their 2024.
It was, frankly, a blockbuster year for them.
Right.
Record revenue, $180.6 billion. Record net income, $58.5 billion. And a key profitability metric, return on tangible common equity, or ROTCE, hit 20%.
Very strong numbers.
Very strong. Plus, they extended $2.8 trillion in credit and capital into the economy, and importantly, they successfully acquired and integrated First Republic Bank after its failure. That stabilized a potentially very risky situation.
And amidst all these huge numbers, he includes this fascinating little detail about the cost of a basic checking account.
Yeah, isn't that interesting? He breaks it down. It costs the bank roughly $225 per year just to maintain one standard checking account. That covers branches, staff, technology, and importantly, fraud protection.
Why highlight that specific cost?
He uses it to illustrate the unintended consequences of regulation, specifically the Durbin Amendment.
Ah, yes, that aimed to reduce fees for merchants on debit card transactions.
It did. It essentially cut the interchange fee revenue banks receive from debit cards in half, but banks still had that $225 annual cost per account to cover.
So they had to make it up elsewhere.
Predictably, yes. They raised other fees, monthly maintenance fees, overdraft fees, etc. And the unintended consequence, he estimates, was that about 1 million more people, likely lower-income individuals, became unbanked because they couldn't meet the new higher fee structures or minimum balances.
A classic case of a regulation backfiring, essentially.
A clear example he uses to argue for more thoughtful, less BLUE tape-style regulation.
This leads us perfectly into the final section we wanted to cover his management philosophy. He calls it the anti-complacency playbook. It's incredibly candid. What's the main message there?
The core warning is simple and stark. Complacency, arrogance, and bureaucracy are the cancers that kill companies, period. He insists leaders must cultivate a sense of constant vigilance, never taking success for granted.
And he really dislikes comparing yourself just to your direct competitors.
Hates it. He says only compare your performance against the absolute best in the world at any given function, not just the peer average, because, as he bluntly puts it, the peer group always includes crummy companies. You need the highest possible benchmark. P&L alone can hide weaknesses.
He gives some great anecdotes about fighting bureaucracy in his own firm. The one about the management coaches is pretty famous.
It really is. He says he got rid of about 500 management coaches across the bank.
500. Why?
His reasoning was that coaching, teaching, and developing your people is a fundamental job of a leader. Outsourcing it to hundreds of coaches means your managers aren't doing their jobs properly. Getting rid of them forced leaders to actually lead. It must have caused quite a stir.
I bet. And there was another one about fixing a huge internal accounting issue.
Yes, he mentions uncovering and correcting a $2 billion annual internal expense allocation. For years, apparently, the consumer bank was effectively subsidizing the investment bank due to flawed internal accounting.
$2 billion a year misallocated internally.
That's the figure he gives. It took real leadership focus, he implies, to find that and fix it, rather than just letting it continue.
And his philosophy on customer complaints seems quite direct, too.
Very direct. He tells his leaders they need to review customer complaints daily, and his mandate is unforgettable. I don't give a damn whether we're technically responsible or not. You've got to do the right thing. Customer trust over technicalities.
It all comes down to confronting reality, doesn't it?
That's the essence of his leadership discipline point. Leaders must attack problems head-on. Put, in his words, all the dead cats, the hard issues on the table. No hiding from bad news or difficult truths.
So bringing it all together, the same relentless focus on reality, efficiency, and outcomes that he demands inside his company, that's what he's arguing America needs writ large.
Exactly. The letter essentially argues that maintaining global leadership and economic strength requires applying that same kind of rigorous, non-ideological, anti-bureaucratic discipline to our national problems. You can't lead the world effectively if your own house isn't in order. Problems, whether corporate or national, don't get better with age.
Which sets up our final thought for you, the listener, perfectly. He strongly advocates tying higher education funding, like federal student loans, directly to outcomes, things like graduate income levels or employment rates.
A controversial idea, but outcome-focused.
So take that principle and broaden it out. Just consider, what if public funding for any major institution, government agencies handling permits, K-12 schools, even defense contractors, was directly linked not just to activities or good intentions, but to measurable long-term economic or social outcomes?
It would certainly change incentives. It would force a much sharper focus on results versus just process or spending.
It really makes you think, are we measuring and therefore managing the things that truly matter for national progress? That's the depth of the challenge laid out here, and that's the end of this deep dive.